Wow, guys, I was talking on mute this entire time. I'm going to go backwards. Thank you for all of your patience with me and your patience with all of the technical details and the technical difficulties. My name is Mauna Kea. I said all of that earlier, but it was completely on on mute, and you were probably reading my lips. But I will start again. So, tēnā koutou katoa, aloha mai kako. Thank you for joining me tonight for this session called Solidarity in the Struggle, Embodied Activism in the Pacific. This is part of Leadership Week 2020. Just a little bit of housekeeping is that I'll make a few statements here right at the beginning, is that this is a Zoom webinar. So if you've never done a Zoom webinar before, you might be wondering why you can't see yourself. And that's because it's a webinar and not a meeting. But don't be alarmed, you're in the right place. Also, I'll be talking for about the first 45 minutes or so, and then we'll save about 15 minutes at the end for questions. So if you have a question, please feel free to drop it into the Q&A section. Also, if you want to ask the question yourself, you can use the raise your hand function, and the organizers, or either the organizers or I, will unmute you so that you can ask your question. Also, just be aware that we are recording this session, and this session will then be posted on the Leadership Week website afterward. So just know that if you're going to use the raise hand function. We also have an electronic live transcriber for this event. So if you need that, or if you want to look at a transcription or a paraphrase transcription of what I'm saying, you can find the link for that posted in the chat. If you have any technical issues or need any assistance, please let us know, and one of the organizers will hopefully help you out. So now that we've gotten through all of the, hopefully any and all mistakes that will happen this evening, including me forgetting to turn my mic on, we'll get started. So, as I mentioned, tonight's session is called Solidarity in the Struggle, Embodied Activism in the Pacific. And I'm going to start with this photo. And if you're a student of mine and you've taken a class with me, you know that I like to start all of my talks and all of my lectures with some sort of art or a photograph or something to kind of get us thinking about the topic that we're going to be looking at, or the theme that we're going to be looking at. And so this particular photo comes from where I'm from. I'm from Hawaii. And this photo was taken at the end of last year at the foot, or at the base of my mountain. And my mountain's name is Mauna Kea. And if you're in Aotearoa, and if you're not that familiar with what's happening in Hawaii, we are currently in a long-standing stand to protect our mountain, to protect Mauna Kea from desecration and destruction. This is a stand that has been ongoing for years. And when I went home last year at the end of 2019, I went to this particular place where this photo was taken, which is a sanctuary that we've created, that Kia'i, or protectors of the mountain, have created for people to come, for people to find strength and solidarity in one another, and for people to show their support for protecting our mountain. What I love about this particular photo is that when I went to the mountain, I saw this row of what I like to call freedom flags. These are flags that represent different tribal nations, or different nations that have either achieved sovereignty or are trying to achieve sovereignty. And right in the forefront here, we see the Morning Star flag, which is the independence flag for our brothers and sisters in West Papua. And all the way in the back, you see the High Hawaii, or the Hawaiian flag, which is the flag that we raise in Hawaii to symbolize our sovereignty, our independence, and everything that we really stand for as Kanaka Maoli, or as Indigenous Hawaiian people. And so I love this photo, and I start off with it because I think it is a beautiful representation of our commitment as people in the Pacific to the betterment of our collective futures. It is this knowing that my independence and my freedom in Hawaii, for instance, is inextricably tied up with the independence and freedom of all of my Pacifica relatives, that I cannot be free until my brothers and sisters in West Papua are free, for example. And so again, I start with this photo because I think it just represents struggle, like these flags are being flown because they represent the struggle of Indigenous peoples in the Pacific, but they also represent the beauty of solidarity and the strength that can come out of shared recognition of each other's struggle. So just to give you a little bit of background about where this talk came from, it was really inspired by a woman named Leanne Simpson, who's a Anishinaabe activist, writer, scholar, overall inspiration. And in her book called As We Have Always Done, she talks about struggle. And so it was after reading her book that I really started to think about struggle as something that is hard and painful, but also something that's quite beautiful. And as Leanne Simpson says, righteous as well. So in the book, she talks about the reality of being an Indigenous person, and to be born as an Indigenous person and to act upon and experience yourself as Indigenous means you're going to experience struggle. Why are you going to struggle, or why are you going to experience struggle? Because as she says, we continue to struggle as people because we are occupied, we're erased, we're displaced, we're disconnected. We struggle because our bodies are still the targets for settler colonial violence. RIMPAC, the Rim of the Pacific Maritime War exercises that happen in Hawaii every 2 years and are set to begin in a couple of weeks, is one example of that. It's an example of how our bodies and our place in Hawaii is continuously disregarded for the pursuits of colonial nations. We continue to struggle as well because it's our heritage. It's our inheritance. Our ancestors engaged in struggle. Our kupuna, our grandparents engaged in struggle for the worlds that they wanted to create. And so we continue to engage in struggle, and we are able to engage in struggle because they've shown us how to do so. So in that sense, again, struggle is hard and it's painful and sometimes it's heartbreaking, but it's also something that we know how to do and something we will continue to engage in because, as Leanne Simpson says, that is our collective gift to the world. It is because we struggle that we will be able to create the futures within which we want to live and within which Indigenous people can grow and thrive. So what's this session about? Well, basically, I've decided I'm gonna come and just tell a few stories. That's the way I teach, honestly. I teach through story. I'm gonna tell you some personal stories, some stories from the Pacific, and my hope is that these stories will touch upon the themes of struggle, of indigeneity, and kind of unpack what indigeneity is and what it means in the Pacific, to also look at the theme of solidarity, to look at the topic of embodied activism, and I'll define all of these things and continue to unpack them as I move through tonight's session. And then also look at stories about Indigenous worlds and Indigenous futures. But if I'm being honest, and I want to tell you what this session is really about, as a teacher, whenever I walk into a classroom, I forgot to mention, I'm a teacher of Pacific Studies here at Victoria University, where this talk is taking place. But whenever I walk into a classroom, I am really upfront with my students. I tell them, of course, I was hired to do certain things, and the class that I'm teaching you has certain course learning objectives. But on top of that, I have another agenda. And my agenda is all about empowering Pacific people and creating a better region for all of us, whether you are of Pacific descent or not. That's my agenda. I want to walk into a classroom and empower you to know your place in the region so that you can help me fight for it and fix it. So that's kind of what this session is also all about. It's an opportunity and it's an invitation for us to think beyond the walls of whatever classroom you might be sitting in or whatever house you're sitting in, wherever you may be in the region, and to start to consider and be critical of your positionality. And all I mean by that is, where are you? Ask yourself that. Whose land are you on? Are you on your own land? Are you on someone else's land? And what does your being there mean? This session is also an invitation to accept the work of solidarity. And I use that term work very purposefully and strategically because solidarity is not sympathy. Solidarity is not just an expression, solidarity is an action. It's a heavy action. It often involves struggle. Yes, it can be beautiful, but it is so much more than just words. It's work. This is also an invitation to engage in what I like to call embodied activism, which is like really just being changed so much by the movement that you are engaged in that you cannot help but live your life differently. And it's also an invitation to help carry the weight of struggle by embracing who you are and what you can bring to whatever struggle or whatever movement you are engaged with as an individual. Activism doesn't look the same for everyone, and it doesn't have to. So this is an invitation to be self-aware, to be self-actualized, and to really be empowered, hopefully, to bring who you are to the struggles that you care most about. I do want to make clear that this session is less of a lecture and more of an opportunity, hopefully, to engage in reflection. And it's more of a sharing than it is a how-to. Like, I'm not teaching you how to be an activist or teaching you how to engage in solidarity. I'm providing some promptings and some things that I've been thinking about over the last so many years, so that hopefully we all, myself included, can be motivated and inspired to continue on in the work of creating better futures and better worlds for our region, for the Pacific, of course, but hopefully for the wider world as well. So if I'm going to ask people to talk about or to think about their own positionality, then I have to be upfront about my own positionality. So who am I? I truly believe, as a Kanaka Maoli woman, as a Hawaiian woman, that who we are is ultimately where and who we come from the mountain to the ocean, generations back. So who I am is a Hawaiian, and Hawaii and my experience growing up in Hawaii has shaped everything I do, everything I stand for, and everything that I know. So I start with these 3 photos here because they feature a place that is at the center of so many of my childhood memories, of my memories from adulthood, and also so many of my inherited ancestral memories. And what I mean by that is that they're memories that I may not have experienced myself, but I was given and gifted. So these photos come from a place called Anaiho'omalu. And what I love about this particular photo, the first photo, is that you can see the connection between Mauna, between mountain, and Kai, or ocean. And, you know, in a Hawaiian worldview, we stand for and protect all of it, from the tip of the mountain all the way down to the ocean, and then into the ocean and everything beyond. The second photo here, you can kind of see it's a makaha. There's a sluice gate, and then there's a channel that goes from the ocean into a fish pond. And so for me, it represents abundance, but it represents sustainability as well. And then the last photo here is my grandmother. So this is my father's mother, who, in all of the stories I've been told about her, was a strong, staunch, small, little Hawaiian woman who I actually never met. She passed away before I was born, and here she is standing on that beach where she took her children, where she practically raised her children, and she's drying meat in the sun. So she has meat, you know, hung on a line, and she's chasing flies away with a coconut branch. And why I bring her into this talk is because I didn't meet her, as I said, in the physical sense, but gosh, I visit her in all of my dreams. And I go to that beach constantly to visit her, to feel closest to her. And she is a huge motivation, again, for everything that I do, because she fought for a better world when she was alive, and my father continues to, and I do now. So it's about acting upon and really acknowledging this whakapapa, or this mo'oku auhau, or this genealogy. So that's a little bit about who I am. And just to give you a very glaringly obvious kind of example of why I stand to protect places, this is what that beach looks like today. So here you see that same mountain in the background. That's actually Hualalai. That's a different mountain on the island that I come from. And this is what that beach looks like. So it's been manicured, right? It's been cleaned. The sand has been made to appear more white. And in the process, our own brown memories have been erased from it. It's now the backdrop to somebody else's fantasy, rather than the beach that my grandmother used to go to catch fish from the makaha, or from the fish pond, or the beach that she used to go to teach her children how to be Indigenous in their place. And so I bring this here, and I bring this in the beginning because I think it represents struggle, that I have very, very early experiences of displacement, of going to a place one day and feeling at home, and the very next day seeing a gate and a lock on a gate and suddenly being labeled a trespasser. Somebody who will be punished if I pass that gate, even though on the other side of that gate is where my memories reside, where my grandmother still resides in all of my memories of her, my inherited memories of her. And I don't bring this up because this is a unique experience. It's actually such a common experience for so many Indigenous people. But that's my positionality. And it is that struggle, that very early experience of struggle, that motivates everything that I do. So why does positionality matter? Well, it encourages us to think about what our being in place means. As I said earlier, it's an opportunity to ask ourselves questions like, how are we positioned in relation to place, to people, to history, and to power? If we are not the Indigenous person living in the place that we're in, how was our being there either facilitated by, motivated by, or enabled by certain power structures? And when we ask ourselves those questions, we provide space for engaging in solidarity with the people whose lands that we're on. So I mentioned earlier, I'm from Hawaii, but I live here in Aotearoa, and that means that I, as a woman who experiences herself as Indigenous, have to be critical of my own positionality here on someone else's land. And so I bring these two photos in because when I first moved to Wellington, to Te Whanganui-a-Tara, here in Aotearoa, I had to ask myself the question, and these are never easy questions to ask, but I had to ask myself, what had to happen in order for me to be here? How was my being here? How is my being here facilitated by colonialism? I live in the middle of a city that was built over extensive waterways. I live on top of streams that I can't hear and that I can't see, but that literally run underneath the concrete. So here I just have two photos. One is of a series of wave-like patterns that were painted on a footpath outside of a petrol station, a gas station. And they mark where a stream runs underwater. The other photo is a photo of the street that I actually live on. So I live on a street called Bulcott in the middle of the city. And according to my own research, because I had to get to know the place, I had to know the place intimately in order to understand my own positionality. I did research about it, and apparently there is a stream that used to run down the curve of that street, or where the street now exists. And at the end of the street, there was this big pool of water called Waikoko, named for the koko, or the birds that were said to have gathered at that pool. And if you're familiar with Wellington City, that pool used to sit at the intersections of Bulcott, Manners, and Willis. And what I find so disturbing about all of that is that big building there is now named Waikoko. So you see this taking of names, you see this taking of history, and this total erasure of an Indigenous history, and this replacement with this building and this new story. By the way, that building is the headquarters of Trust Power. So you've got this huge electronic power house, literally sitting on top of a stream, stealing its name. So what does all of this teach me as an Indigenous woman living in somebody else's homeland? I have to be critical of the colonial powers that continue to oppress them and erase them and seek to replace them. And I have to use my own positionality and my own privilege to tell those stories that are literally running underneath the concrete. Now, I should note, what does it mean to be Indigenous? I've been using that term a lot, and the term Indigenous has particular functionality in the Pacific. So in order to kind of unpack that very briefly, what does it mean to be Indigenous? People have all kinds of different interpretations. In fact, we could do a whole webinar series just on that term alone. But I think it's helpful when we look at the Pacific region to think about this particular working definition that came out of a United Nations study back in the 1980s. So this study was done by Jose Martinez Cobo, who was commissioned to do this work, to kind of go out and survey and talk to Indigenous people around the world to see how they identified themselves. And so in this working definition that is often quoted, he talks about how Indigenous peoples are those that have historical continuity with pre-invasion societies or pre-colonial societies, but right now find themselves to be non-dominant sectors of the societies that they live in. Even though they are determined to persevere, to develop, to continue to teach their children their culture, to maintain their language, they find themselves in this position where they are now the non-dominant part of society. He goes on to say, and other follow-up reports have gone on to say, that Indigenous peoples, unfortunately, are often the minority in their own homeland. And with that positionality, with being pushed out of the way, with being made to become a minority in your own homeland, comes struggle. So when we talk about solidarity, when we talk about people coming together, we've been able to witness across the world, but in the Pacific as well, that Indigenous people continue to come together because of a shared experience and a recognition of struggle. It's those struggles that come with displacement, that come with ongoing erasure, that come with ongoing dispossession. And I want to point out that a recognition of struggle doesn't have to flatten diversity or specificity. Just last week, I was in Christchurch doing a talk about West Papua. And I was on a panel, and one of my fellow panelists was from West Papua. And before we got to the forum, we were driving around Christchurch, and I remember him saying quite clearly, he was like, Emalani, Hawaii and West Papua, they're the same. And I knew what he meant. He meant we're the same in that we are both under prolonged military occupation, and making that connection and being able for him to look at me and me to look at him and say, I see you and I understand and I'm here, doesn't at all erase the specificity of our experiences. The fact that I can raise my flag and he cannot. The fact that he lives here in Aotearoa and is very vocal about the ongoing slow motion genocide in West Papua and therefore may not ever be able to go home. So it's not to flatten the diversity and it's not to ignore that diversity, it's actually to honor it by recognizing the ways that we connect and then embracing and recognizing all the ways that we are different. So all of this is to say that recognition of struggle, of a shared experience of struggle, creates opportunity for meaningful solidarity. So I wanted to bring in a few examples, just a few recent examples of Indigenous to Indigenous or trans-Indigenous solidarity in the Pacific. And I think last year, earlier, my first photo and the photo that continues to feature on the side of my slides here is from Mauna Kea. It's from the mountain that we are standing to protect, that many of us continue to stand to protect and will continue to protect forever. And right around the time this sanctuary, this pu'uhonua, was established last year at the base of Mauna Kea, just a few days later, eviction notices were were delivered to those who were stationed at Ihumatao up in the Auckland area in New Zealand. And so we saw this beautiful expression of solidarity between people who are at both places, who are at Mauna Kea or who are at Ihumatao. And I won't play this video for the sake of time, but please, I highly recommend go and watch this video. This video features a group up at Ihumatao who learned one of the chants and songs that we do on the Mauna, that we do all over Hawaii, ku ha'aheo, we do it all the time. They learned the words, they made it their own, and they recorded it, and they participated in the Mauna Kea, or the worldwide jam. I think it was called Jam for the Mauna, or Mauna Kea Jam. And it was in that expression of solidarity, it was in that sung and chanted expression saying, I see you and I'm here, that people on the Mauna, that people on Mauna Kea were strengthened. And there were all of these exchanges. I can cite so many examples of people here who created t-shirts, who sold merchandise and then donated all of the proceeds. I can cite examples of people in Hawaii sending their solidarity to people at Ihumatao, and it was a beautiful exchange, and it continues. Last year, and I'm not showing this photo because I'm in it, I'm showing this photo because last year, after I went home to the Mauna, I returned to Aotearoa, and I was able to go to Ihumatao. And when I was there delivering a statement of solidarity, the amazing Leone Pihama and another group of Maori from Aotearoa were in Hawaii, and we timed it so that our deliveries would be synced and so that we could deliver statements of solidarity to each other's homelands at the same time. And so you can see, again, this recognition of struggle, but how from that recognition of struggle, there is this beautiful solidarity. And it's in that beautiful expression of solidarity that I think we see the kinds of worlds we're fighting for, right? We kind of see what our Indigenous futures can look like when we're in control of our lands, of our resources, of our people's futures. So but you know, the question still has to be asked. After I looked at the working definition of indigeneity, what about all the people in the Pacific who don't identify as Indigenous? And I'm not just talking about Pākehā or Palangi or Haole. I'm not just talking about people who are not of Pacific heritage. I'm actually talking about Pacific peoples of Pacific heritage who don't experience themselves as Indigenous. There are people in the Pacific, for example, who don't have much use for that term. Why? Because they are the majority in their homelands. And they don't actually even want to be associated with the term Indigenous because of all of the negative connotations that it carries. So what about all of these people? Now, I do want to just ask these questions, and these are things that I continuously think about. For all of the Pacific people in the region who are of Pacific descent, but don't consider themselves to be Indigenous, we have to consider, if we apply that term to everyone as kind of this umbrella term, are we then not allowing for the range of ways there is to be and know oneself as Pacific? And even more importantly, perhaps, if our most powerful and salient solidarities are between those who have struggled in similar ways, those who do identify as being Indigenous because they have been marginalized and have become minorities, then are our connections and disconnections being facilitated by colonialism? Are Hawaiians and Maori so close, for example, because we've struggled the same? And if that is the case, then what about all of our connections to other places and other peoples in the Pacific that haven't struggled in the same way? I don't necessarily have quick and fast answers for these questions, but these are things that I think about a lot, because in expressing my solidarity with people in the Pacific, I have to be upfront and critical of myself and acknowledge that I've probably excluded and included certain people just based on the similarity of their struggle to my struggle. So yeah, these are big questions I think we have to unpack when we think about solidarity across the region. So for me, I think if we don't consider ourselves to be Indigenous, but we live in a place where there are people who do consider themselves to be Indigenous, then we have to recognize why indigeneity functions and why it matters and why it has to matter. It matters here in Aotearoa, for example. So this is for all of the Pacifica people, perhaps, who didn't grow up thinking of themselves as Indigenous, but who do live in Aotearoa. We have a responsibility to recognize how and why indigeneity matters. Sorry, I see something popping up on my screen. How and why indigeneity matters here in Aotearoa. Indigeneity matters in places like Hawaii, in places like Wahan, in places like West Papua, where the West Papuans are quickly becoming a minority in their own homeland because of transmigration policies from Indonesia. So why does indigeneity function, and how can we be part of supporting Indigenous rights in the places that we live rather than taking away from them? And for me, this means going even beyond the distinctions of Indigenous or not Indigenous, Pacifica, or whatever we want to call ourselves, and just building on whakapapa, on genealogy. It is genealogy that obligates me to the region, that motivates me to recognize your struggle, even if it might be a little bit different than my own, And again, to go back to my earlier statement, to know that if I want to be free and independent as an Indigenous person, or even just as a woman in the Pacific, that means I have to help every other person in the Pacific to also be free and independent, whatever that looks like. So I just wanted to note that with Mauna Kea and Ihumātao, we also saw beautiful expressions of solidarity from people who might not consider themselves as Indigenous, or might not use that term, I should say. They're not using that Western term. They know themselves as first people of the places that they come from. They know themselves as genealogically connected to the places they come from, but they might not use that terminology, again, because of all of the negative hangups that are attached to it. So we did see a lot of Pacifica Solidarity. This is just an example from the Mauna Kea, where we had contingents and representation come from different Pacific nations. So here you've got Samoa, American Samoa, the Cook Islands, Aotearoa, of course, with the Tino flag. And then we had a huge, massive contingent representing Tonga. Some other examples of Pacifica Solidarity here in Aotearoa, I often look to and find so much inspiration from the work of Oceania Interrupted. Oceania Interrupted is a Pacific and Maori women's collective that is dedicated to performing different artistic actions to interrupt spaces. And interrupting spaces is quite essential for bringing awareness to the struggles in West Papua. I was really blessed to participate in a few of the actions with Oceania Interrupted, and this is just an example of using your body and using your agency to break into spaces, to make people stop and look and wonder and then learn. So this again is Pacifica Solidarity that goes beyond those Western terms like Indigenous, that builds upon whakapapa or genealogy. We've also have many examples of people standing for our shared inheritance. And I use shared inheritance in quotation marks because that comes from the Oceanian scholar Epeli Hau'ofa, who talked about in his work, he talked about how some of the most powerful expressions of sovereignty, of radical sovereignty, but the most powerful expressions of solidarity also came when people were fighting for our shared inheritance. And that is our moana, that's our ocean, and that's our environment. So you could see that in everything from the nuclear-free and independent Pacific from a few decades ago, all the way to just last year, when we had the major strike for climate change that took place here in Wellington, and you could see the Pacific climate warriors or representation from different Pacific nations at the forefront, standing for each other. You know, we might think of the communities that are being most impacted by climate change as being distant, as being out there in the other parts of the region. But here you saw young people. I was so inspired because you saw young people here standing up for them, saying, I'm here in Aotearoa, what can I do to not only stand in solidarity with you, but to act and do something and lobby the government and make sure that we can actually witness change to help them. I also just want to point out that even though solidarity can be quite beautiful, solidarity in the struggle can be quite beautiful, right? That doesn't mean that there isn't also struggle in the solidarity. And so I just pose these questions here, and I'm going to try to, I realize I'm running a little bit low on time, so I'll try to be a bit quick here, but how do we move beyond hashtag solidarity, right? How do we move beyond just clicktivism or clicking and liking things? How do we move beyond performative activism? How do we move beyond what is Instagrammable into what is embodied? I often tell my students, some of the hardest solidarity work is not Instagrammable. Some of the hardest solidarity work is when you sit down with yourself at home and you become critical and you ask yourself about your actions and you ask yourself about your preconceived notions, about your assumptions, about your own inherent racism. That's sometimes where the hardest work happens. And so I think, you know, when we look at solidarity, it's about kind of getting past the movement that becomes popular for the moment and engaging ourselves in that movement for the long haul, whether someone's looking and taking a photo or not. And so to get back to Leanne Simpson, you know, she just encourages us, like, we have to be engaged, body, mind, spirit, in the movement. If you want to be changed by it, you have to engage, and you have to begin to create a different future. And how you begin to create a different future, that's, you have to live differently in the present. If we just go along with the status quo and like and post a few things here and there, and I'm calling myself out on this as well, then we're not actually going to change the present. So we have to engage to be changed and begin to live differently. I also want to point out that solidarity in the struggle means that we must see people as more than their struggles. If we only see people in the Pacific, for example, as the struggles that they've gone through and the struggles they continue to experience, then we are being too reductive. West Papua is so much more than genocide. Yes, that is a major issue there right now that needs to be at the forefront of our awareness, but we also need to know of West Papuans as more than that. We need to know of them as people with hopes and dreams and talents and ancestral gifts, as people who deserve to live just because they deserve to live like everybody else. We need to know about the Marshall Islands as more than nuclear testing, Tuvalu as more than climate change, Hawaii as more than being an occupied nation that is a tourist paradise or that has become a tourist paradise. Of course, we need to know those things, but we also need to see people as being fully human, capable, diverse, lovable, intelligent, hopeful, worthy, etc. I could say the same thing for the Black Lives Matter movement. We need to know about the causes of police brutality. We need to dismantle structural racism, but we also need to celebrate Black lives for being the intelligent intellectuals, artists, poets, you know, scholars, inventors that have added to our lives. So we have to see people as more than the struggles. And that gets me to the topic of embodied activism. What do I mean by embodied activism? For me, embodied activism means that you are so changed by the experience of being active that, again, you just can't help but live better. You just can't help but live differently. If you are concerned about climate change, for example, how can I live differently? How can we live differently? How can we reduce our plastic waste? How can we start buying locally? How can we make the small embodied changes in our every single day life that will help us to live in more alignment with the future that we want to create? So we have to be changed by the movement. Embodied activism is about changing the way that you live. It's about seeing connections as well. It's about knowing that you don't have to travel to a place to help it or to stand in solidarity. And in fact, sometimes you can do more in the place that you're in. So last year, when I couldn't go home right away to be at Mauna Kea, I wrote this blog called 30 Ways to Stand for Mauna Kea when you can't physically stand on Mauna Kea. And I did it because I had to come to church, or I had to deal with the sadness of not being able to go home, but then also become really critical with myself and say, hey, Amalani, suck it up. You can't go home. So rather than crying about not being able to go home, you need to ask yourself what you can do because you're not at home, because there's so much more that you can do. We could say the same for West Papua. We shouldn't travel there. We shouldn't go there. We should instead think about what our, certain privileges in the countries that we're in allow us to do for them. So distance never ever means that we don't have obligations. Distance does not allow us to be lazy. Distance actually obligates us to act and stand even stronger. So coming towards the end of my talk here, this is an invitation to know who you are and know what you can do. I often have students ask, they say, I don't want to stand in front of a march. I don't want to hold a microphone. I don't want to do a speech. That's fine. There are so many different ways that you can be active. There are so many different ways that you can show your solidarity. It means bringing you and all of your gifts and all of your insights to the movement, understanding your positionality in relation to that movement, of course, but bringing who you are. We need the people who are standing on the front lines just as much as we need the people who are doing the speeches, just as much as we need the people who are going to rub the shoulders of those who were standing in the front lines, just as much as we need the people who are going to cook the food, the people who are going to make the infographics, the people who are going to film and document and make sure we have a record of all of this movement for the future. We need everyone. So be self-aware and be self-actualized and know that you have something to bring. And finally, continue to engage in the practice of dreaming and creating better futures. Oftentimes, I think we get so caught up in the movements or in the struggle of the things that we're standing against that we sometimes forget what we're standing for. And I mean down to the tiniest detail. I know I'm standing for justice. I know I'm standing for freedom. I know I'm standing for sovereignty, but down to the tiniest detail, what kind of world do I want to live in? What do I want to wake up to in the morning? What do I want to wake me up in the morning? What do I want the land to look like? What do I want to be fed and nourished by? And so I bring in a few poems here or a few examples of Indigenous futures. A couple of weeks ago, I was honored to hold a poetry workshop with a group of Wahine who each wrote down some of their freedom dreams, their dreams for free, independent, decolonized, demilitarized futures. And it's these dreams that sustain us and that motivate us and that continue to give us something to hope and work for in the present. I just also wanted to end with another example of beautiful solidarity and dreaming. This is a poem that was put together a few weeks ago. Shout out to the amazing Mikey Inouye who helped to put this together. But this poem features Indigenous poets from across the region and one Indigenous poet from Turtle Island calling for not only the cancellation of RIMPAC, and a huge aloha to all of my Cancel RIMPAC Coalition, HOA, but this is not just calling for the cancellation of war games, this is calling for a better future. And so again, it's just another example that builds on a long whakapapa or a long genealogy of resistance and solidarity in the region. And this is just one of the latest ones, I think. So to sum up, before I answer some questions, I really hope that this session provided you with opportunities to reflect on your positionality, to accept the work of solidarity, to consider embodied activism and what that might look like for you, and to also embrace your potential. As I said, this is not a how-to, this is not me trying to pretend that I'm any kind of authority. This is just me speaking as an Indigenous woman who has experienced struggle, who's engaged in struggle, and who continuously hopes for better futures because I believe that's my genealogical responsibility to the region and to all of you. So yeah, I think I'll end there. And I'll try to answer some questions. So I'll go to the Q&A. Again, if you want to raise your hand and ask a question, you can do so, and I'll try to figure out how to answer it or how to see that you're raising your hand. All right, I've got one question here. As Pacific in New Zealand, how can we address those who we feel like they need to put a stake in the ground to make their Pacific presence felt in this land without acknowledging the oppression that still exists on our Maori cousins? That's an excellent question. That's an excellent question. I think for me, personally, as a Pacifica person in New Zealand, I think I have to use my positionality as someone who is not Maori to also speak to those who are not Maori, to remind them of the importance of indigeneity. And again, why Indigenous rights have to matter in a place that has suffered the consequences and continues to suffer the consequences and legacies of colonialism. I find it really difficult when people claim indigeneity to the region as a means of claiming indigeneity to a specific place. And I've heard that said, and I've heard that kind of claim happen more than a handful of times, where somebody who is of Pacifica descent says, no, I have a right to be here because I'm Indigenous to the region. And yes, we might be. I do consider myself a descendant of the first peoples of the region, but that does not give me any claim to space here. Not in a place where Indigenous people are still trying to find their place, are still fighting for their place. So as Pacifica, I think we just have to be open and willing to speak honestly with other Pacifica people, especially those who are trying to literally like stick a stake in the ground and claim space. It's not our space to claim. And we have to make sure and constantly ask ourselves, if I do want to claim a space, what does that mean for the Indigenous people? The Indigenous people have to be forefront always. Otherwise, we are part of the problem. So yeah, I think that's an excellent question. And it just calls on us to use our positionality to help tangata whenua, for example, here in Aotearoa. Mahalo for that question. I'll go to the chat now. That was the only question in the Q&A. There might be some questions about here. Let's see. It looks like, oh, sorry. I'm so sorry about the mute, about not turning my mic on earlier. It looks like that's the only question. Oh, wait, here we go. Yeah. If anyone else has any questions, please let me know. I'm happy to answer them. Yeah. Maybe I'll wait a couple of minutes. You know, to be honest, that question about positionality and our role as Pacifica people in New Zealand, I have to be honest and say that I probably wouldn't have even thought about that if I never moved here. In Hawaii, I am the Indigenous person, right? That's my homeland, that's where I'm from. Coming here, though it sounds simple, has forced me to ask that question. Okay, what does it mean to be Indigenous on land you're not Indigenous to? And it sounds like a simple question, but gosh, that requires a lot of introspection and reflection and a willingness to be honest with myself. Yeah, I have something here from Peace Movement Aotearoa. If no more questions, you could talk more about your hopes and vision for the future. Thank you. Thank you for that opportunity. I will admit I don't often allow myself to go there sometimes, to think down to the tiniest detail, but my hope for the future and the future that I envision for my children, for my grandchildren, you know, if I ever have them, is that we're able to grow and raise the next generations on lands that are clean, with water that is clean, on land that we have access to, that we can plant and farm as we want to, that we don't have to ask permission for those things. I dream of a future where West Papua is free, where the military buildup is no longer happening in places like Guahan, where Indigenous people again have control of the way they breathe and how they breathe and the air they breathe, where islanders aren't scared of the ocean rising and taking away their homelands, but are once again embracing the ocean that's in them as part of their inheritance. Yeah, so that's just a little bit of what I dream of. Healthy, sovereign futures full of breath. Yeah. I've got another question here. Do you believe that mental illness has had an effect on those that are Indigenous? I would say, I believe those who are Indigenous do suffer with mental illness, if that's what you're asking, and I think it's because of the struggle. It's not easy being Indigenous, and for those of us who identify and act upon that indigeneity every day, we know that. We know how taxing it can be to engage in struggle, especially if you choose to be active. We know that it can put a strain on relationships, that it can impact you personally. So yes, I would say that indigeneity, for as beautiful as it can be, because it's so hard and can be painful, does and can impact your mental health. And I speak from personal experience on that one. I would love to hear you speak a bit more about your involvement in Oceania Interrupted and the balance between physical and rhetorical forms of embodied activism. Thank you for that question. In Oceania Interrupted, I engaged in a few actions. I think it was back in 2016, and that was an entirely new experience for me. I'm a very wordy person. I like words, and Oceania Interrupted, the actions that I engaged with, my mouth was covered. I had to be silent. I had to tie my hands behind my back and walk through public spaces, being silent, but being a physical presence. And that was really different for me and challenging in a kind of beautiful way. Challenging in that it made me realize what it is to walk into a space and not be able to talk and not be able to be heard. And what are the challenges that come with that? It also forced me to get outside of my comfort zone, to walk through, for example, the huge Pacifica festival that was happening here in Wellington and interrupt a space, not for myself, but for somebody else. So I think that encouraged me to see that how activism and engaging in activism is not actually about us. And it's in fact when we get in the way of the movement, or when we get in the way and when we fill ourselves with doubt and fear, that we keep ourselves from being everything that we need to be for the movement. So Oceania Interrupted was a profound experience for me for that reason. Get out of your own way, Amalani, because the world needs more of you. So that was what I learned there. As a Pacifica Wahine coming to Aotearoa, what are some of the challenges you faced in terms of your indigeneity on another land? I think kind of just thinking about some of the things that I said earlier, being a Pacifica woman here, first of all, there are not many Hawaiians. So one challenge is that I didn't have a big Hawaiian community with which to kind of live with and find my own Hawaiian solidarity with. Thankfully, I found myself part of a much larger Pacifica fauna, which is gorgeous, which I absolutely love, that people have just kind of taken me in because I didn't have that Hawaiian base here in Aotearoa. But some of the challenges, again, to get back to the challenges, living here continuously encourages me and requires of me that requires that I align myself with the Indigenous people. If I'm not Indigenous, but I recognize some of their struggles, then I can't be part of the problem. And what does that mean then? That means then that if somebody asks me to help them carry the burden of a movement, then I'm gonna do so in the ways that I can. You know, like if somebody asks me to speak on a controversial topic like Cook's landing and Cook's invasion of Aotearoa in 1769, then I'm going to talk about it. Sometimes because my positionality as not Maori might mean somebody might listen to me because they're used to hearing it from Maori. It's the same as if I were home in Hawaii preaching about protecting Mauna Kea. If somebody came from Aotearoa and also talked about protecting Mauna Kea, people are bound to listen because they expect to hear it from Hawaiians, right? So I think that that's my role here. That's one of the things that I've taken on as my role, is that when I'm asked to be part of a movement that is for the betterment of Maori, for the betterment of Tangata Whenua, that's what I have to do. And so I don't know if that answers your question. That's not necessarily a challenge. I guess the challenge was me trying to find my place, which I'm continuously trying to do. And always being, I've actually found comfort in being a little bit uncomfortable all the time. It's like, I don't want to feel too settled here. So I keep myself slightly on edge, always being very upfront about my positionality so that I can help. But that's something that I'm still learning. So yeah, those are all the Q&A questions. I've got a question about healing. Yeah, in response, maybe this will be the last one that I'll answer, and then I I've realized we've run out of time, but I think this is a good question. It says, in response to the question about mental health, what is healing? You know, I think healing is returning to place, whether it's in memory, and returning to people, and returning to whakapapa, and remembering who we come from and where we come from and why we are in the world. I find healing when I take time to breathe, when I take time to chant. I say chanting because if you know me well, you know I can't sing, but I love chant and I love language and I love dancing. I find healing when I dance, when I engage in hula, when I dance the stories of my ancestors and remember the worlds that they gave motion and sound to. I find healing when I draw on the strength of my genealogy. And that extends into the Pacific. I find healing in other people, and I hope that I can be healing for other people as well. And I'll end on this note. I started with a photo that was at the sanctuary, at a pu'uhonua that we established at the base of the mountain. And I remember when I was standing there last year, I remember this. I remember thinking, and I even wrote it in my journal, we can be sanctuaries for each other. We can be sanctuaries of safety and reprieve for each other. I find healing in that. I find healing in the strength of my fellow Pacifica in the region. I find healing in the strength of Maori, and I hope at the same time that they can find that in me. And when we are able to recognize that in each other, I think we will be strengthened by it and strengthened for it. So thank you so much, everyone. Mahalo nui loa for joining me tonight. And again, for being patient with me, not knowing to unmute my mic. And for, going on this little journey with me. I truly, truly appreciate it. And let's all go home and dream of some futures, some bright, beautiful, sovereign futures, and then do what we can to create them.